Don't eat that. Don't touch that. Don't do that. We seem to get warnings for everything these days, right? But in this modern era, are our weather warnings keeping up with the times in which we live? Welcome to What Is It About the Weather podcast, where we explore the many ways that weather intertwines itself into our lives. I'm your host, Mark Jelenic, and this week, we're going to do that. We're going to talk about weather warnings. But before I get there, as always, let me just take a moment and say I hope you're having some good weather. I'm in that last stretch. I'm not going to dwell on, we all know I'm not a summer fan, but dealing with a little hot weather, just taking it in stride. But it kind of makes me want to be like, not talking or thinking about the weather. You know, the other part is with this time of year, as most of you know, I'm often thinking about tropical cyclones in the Atlantic Basin. And so far, there just ain't been much to talk about. I mean, it's kind of creepy quiet. And that's one of those things that, you know, anytime, and it's not unique to what I do. I think a lot of us are working fields where we're anticipating something, we're expecting something, we're kind of, you know, used to something behaving a certain way or going about a certain way or something close to it, you know, within a range at least. And when it falls well outside that range, it just gets a little creepy. So I hope nothing big happens. I hope it's not one of those years where it's really quiet and then all of a sudden we have one of those major devastating type hurricanes. Actually, Hurricane Andrew, if I recall, was in a year not dissimilar where we had a really quiet year. And then, you know, at the time it was a particularly devastating hurricane to the United States. Certainly we've had more since then, but it had been a while, right? And that one was a pretty devastating event. So I don't know. Like I said, I hope your weather is within some norms. I know the heat this summer has been intolerable for many folks. Does seem like that's tempered down in many places, but that can take a while, right, to recoup from. Still a lot of droughts going on, although there are places like out in Las Vegas that went from horrible droughts to the casinos all flooding. Why does that not surprise me? But as the saying goes, sometimes when it rains, it pours. But all these things, when we're dealing with the extremes, it's a reminder of weather warnings. And when I was on my trip to Canada, I was reminded of just that. Okay? So I went to Canada, and literally I drove in, and it was actually really nice. So I've been to Canada twice this year. First time, it was kind of when they first started post, you know, kind of COVID protocols, started letting people back in for tourism type stuff. Got to the border, had all the stuff ready. Still had to, they gave me a spot test. I didn't do it there. It's really kind of interesting. I can't remember if I told this story or not, but I had to take the little kit with me and do it later. This time around, got to the border, and you could even see the little COVID test in there like they occasionally give them out, but went to a different border crossing. But in case, it took seconds to get through. It wasn't very long. It was all pretty good, but it started raining almost immediately. And for, you know, I've been dealing with the drought where I am. Not as bad, but it's been a dryish late spring summer. And it started raining, and I still had a long way to drive that day. This was one of those trips covered a lot of ground, and it was going to be a lot of driving, and it just started raining. And it rained, and it rained, and it rained, and it rained, and it rained for 6 hours nonstop. Not kidding you. It rained. There was one point where it lightened up, and I thought, it's going to be okay, right? That didn't last. So in the beginning, it rained, you know, it was little sprinkles maybe for the first hour, but there was a solid 6 hour window in there. And then towards the end, it did lighten up again. It lightened up, and thankfully it lightened up enough like to unload the car and stuff. But it downpoured. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, how would I know? How would I know if I got problems going on? You know, I got enough going on, and I have somebody in the car with me. And I can say, check this, check that. Here's all the good apps I know. Here, I've got them all on. You know, you can load them because I share them with you. And take a look at that. Show it to me. You know, I'm trying not to do these things while I'm driving, but you know, keeping an eye on things. But I really hadn't thought about, because I don't think of Canada from a summer weather standpoint, particularly where I'm going. if it's not a hurricane type event, I don't think of it being overly problematic. I kind of know the potential challenges. But it was just one of those things, and it got me. And then on that same trip, right, I went and did this hike. So it was actually the next day. So the system, the rain had blown through, but probably wasn't the core of the system. Next day, it's kind of windy. Got up, still raining a little bit, but it's really, really windy. And we were going to do this hike that you actually start kind of on the crest. You have to hike up a little bit from a parking area, but then you kind of walk out over this crest, and then you take some steps down, and it's kind of at a cliff area, if you will. Now, it's not like, you're walking steep steps down, but they're kind of like platforms, little step platforms you go down. But you go down a few hundred feet, right? And it's these amazing views. And, I asked the ranger, is there any concerns? Or is this a hike we should worry about, or anything he thought we should know? At the little visitor center area. And he says, done this hike in the rain. It's actually an enjoyable hike. Think you'll enjoy it. And yeah, it's windy up there, but it's you don't need to worry. You're not going to get blown off the platform. So we get there, right? And this is a hike that usually it's one of the highlight hikes of this park. Get there, doing the hike, and we start walking out, and it is windy. But when we parked, a lot of times they had two parking areas, and we were able to go all the way to the furthest one, and there was one other car, repeat one. And this wasn't like we weren't the first people in the park in the day. So it's like, okay, it's still summer. It seems a little odd. And walking out there, and we see these people finally coming back, and they're all smiles. Now, I'm in Canada, and English was not their first language, I'll say that, but their English was fine. I mean, we went straight into English, and they were telling us how they had seen some moose, which is kind of cool. And, we're just kind of sharing their story. And I told them what the ranger said. He said, when we, get out there, it'll probably be windy, but you don't need to worry that you'll get blown off the trail or off the platforms. And they said, actually, you might. And we had to get down on our hands and knees to go down. We didn't go very far, but we only went to kind of like the first, outcropping thing, which is only like, let's say 50 feet away or whatever, and only down like, 25 feet or so. And it was like, okay, we took all that into advisement, and we got out there. And you kind of go, when you start the hike, you're kind of in this little protected, it's a boreal forest. So it's not tall trees. It's kind of, everything's kind of lower growth, but we're getting out there, and the wind's picking up, and it's windy, right? And you walk out to the first kind of where the platforms start, and it's windy. I mean, it's not kind of windy, it's windy. And I'm looking and I'm going, all right, is it the ranger or the people that I believe? And at that point I'm going, well, I'm not sure, right? Start making a way down, and we're just being blown. I mean, I've got hiking sticks or, poles, and I'm putting on either side of the platform. Now, they built the platform to kind of protect the ground around it. Now, they do have some other, like rock and stuff that they've spread out. Clearly, this is a high usage trail, but they are trying to protect the forest. And actually, they'd even done this whole thing where they're trying to protect it from the moose as well, which they've got a lot of up there these days. And they, getting down there, and I'm barely holding on, and we get to the first thing and sit down, and I have this picture of my wife sitting there with the thing, and it's blowing her around, and we start walking back. I honestly felt like we were going to get blown off the platform. So it did actually feel like we were going to get blown off the platform. We didn't go down as far. We kind of did like the other couple. Never got down on our hands and knees, but didn't go very far either. Now, as we worked our way back, I shared that story with somebody else. Thankfully, it looked like the wind was kind of letting up as the day progressed, but it was just a reminder. I didn't check an app specifically for the wind forecast, but I went to what I thought was a trusted person and asked them for their input. And I'm reminded that we humans don't always get things right? And I was reminded about this in the context just a couple of days ago. A family member called and said, "Why didn't you tell me I was going to potentially lose my life when I was driving around home yesterday with these torrential rains?" I'm like, what good it would do? I shouldn't be the one telling you that, right? I always, like with hurricanes and things like that, do remember where family members are and try to keep them informed when I know stuff. But a lot of times the best information is going to come from resources close to you or ones that are focused on the messaging that's specifically about keeping you safe, right? And that's not always my specialty. A lot of what I'm doing and the forecasting I'm working with is more about resources and thinking larger scale and thinking about large areas, not necessarily the person as an individual, right? And between my own experiences and that, I started thinking, I've talked about this whole weather warning thing a bit. Do I have it right or wrong, or what really is the right approach for the day and age in which we live? Because as I was driving through Canada, there was a very non-weather thing that hit me. So I mentioned this thing about moose. Now, in the maritime provinces where I was, and even in towards Quebec, okay, so a little western, but let's say northeast Canada, they have a real high moose population. And we took the ferry out to Newfoundland. It was a great experience. But Newfoundland, if I remember my statistics correctly, has more moose than they do people at this stage. Now, unfortunately, I never saw any. My timing did not work out when I was trying to do the moose watching, because you really need to kind of do a sunrise, sunset thing. I would have liked to seen one. Doesn't really matter. But I noticed not only was there lots of signs and warnings, but they've erected these huge fence areas along interstates and stuff to keep moose from getting out. Because anybody knows anything about a moose, these things are huge. Even, calves can be fairly large. So whether it's the male or the female, these are very large creatures, and interaction with a vehicle is not going to go well for either party involved. Trust me on that. And so they do a lot of stuff, but that seemed very standardized. There was, yes, and maybe some differences in how they implemented the fencing systems, and some of the newer fencing systems look much more sturdy than the old ones. But the warning signs and the approach seemed to be consistent from province to province. We covered 5 different provinces while we were up there. Now I'm in the part of Canada where those 5 provinces probably fit in the Northwest Territories or something. But, it's still seeing differences, right, potentially within those areas. They all kind of employed the same approach. So whether I was in Quebec, where French is the primary language, or New Brunswick, where it's bilingual, or the other maritime provinces where English is the language, the primary language, I could kind of tell where the moose things were and that I needed to pay attention and what I needed to pay attention for. It's like no different, like the bathroom signs. I know where the bathroom signs are and what they look like, whether there's words or not. I know what those 2 little people mean. If I need to go to the bathroom, there's going to be one there. But the deer crossing, I'm assuming it's deer crossing. I guess it could have been caribou crossing or something else. They were very different. Some of them had these kind of, majestic, legs stretched out kind of horizontally as if they could jump over the whole interstate when they were going by. These other ones looked like they were kung fu fighting or something. They had these weird things. And it was kind of funny, right? So we were kind of laughing about how these signs change from place to place. And I didn't know how to interpret that. Was it just a deer warning sign? Probably. But each one of them could have told me something different. And it got me to thinking about weather and how we convey these messages. Now, when I was a kid, weather radios were kind of still a newer technology back then. And I had one. Now, besides driving my parents crazy every time a warning came off and that thing would go off, it was a way to share a standardized message and to warn people. And in the United States, we have a lot of different types of weather that people need warning for. And so it was a great mechanism for doing that. But a lot of times, those sort of systems were designed more for that emergency situation. And I think of that as being, a tornado type event or something where people are going to have a very short period of time to respond, right? These kind of quick upon us sort of events, if you will. Not as much let's say a hurricane or a tropical cyclone, typhoon, depending on where you live, or a heat wave, where you have more time and you might be able to convey a message through a bunch of different channels, okay? So Canada does have, like the U.S. weather radio system, they do have alerts on their websites. You can subscribe to RSS feeds, but it's very similar to the U.S. So, I kind of knew I was going to be okay, and I had enough weather apps. I wasn't too concerned about it, but I hadn't really thought about it before. And I know everybody around the globe has different ones, but I started really wondering, Are we doing it right? And the reason I say that is you've heard me talk about message standardization. And one of the challenges with a lot of the U.S. warning systems is they don't always make sense because they've been kind of built on top of each other and layered, and maybe things should have been done in reverse order, sort of thing. It feels that way sometimes. Or you're trying to make something, the old square peg fit in a round hole, because the way a hurricane is very different than a tornado. And how many different layers do you need, or how many different types of warnings do you need, and what are they conveying, and what's important there? And I started really thinking that maybe the best approach, because if you look at other things too, we have all sorts of warning systems, right? It doesn't have to be just weather. It can be other natural things, like let's say tsunamis, which can be devastating, earthquakes leading to tsunamis quite often, right? Things like modern day things you're hearing more about, like wildfires, right? So we've got all these natural things, but you have them with other things too. We've had it with COVID, certainly. And there's different things we got to take into account. One is we got to deal with different situations. And one is often that we have to deal with a large group of people, right? Everybody, we all do this, right? We all have our own way of responding to the same information, which is not necessarily a good thing. So you've got to have enough of a standardized message to get the masses to behave in a certain way that you need them to. And I'm going to stick with the weather example here. Let's say you've got a hurricane coming into Florida and I need to move a lot of people out of the harm's way. I've got to coordinate that. You don't just want people going, ah, and, running down the street and driving into each other. You got to have enough time to collectively get those people in their vehicles probably and drive out of the harm's way, right? But there's a real risk that if it doesn't come, people are going to be mad. But there is an understanding that there's always some risk that because you need more lead time, that there's a chance you might warn and it not happen. That's a reality, right? And like I said, we learned some of these things with COVID as well. But so there's this need to work with large groups, number one. But sometimes the time scale is very important too. Are we talking we need seconds or minutes to respond, or we need a lifetime, right? So like, let's say you get exposed to something and you yell at somebody, right, to keep them from touching something hot, let's say, right? Or you grab their hand and they get mad at you, but later they realize that you were just protecting them from touching something hot that they didn't realize they were about to burn their hand on. And, it all works out. But we take in all these different things that come into play, and we still got this other side of the equation, which is me as a person, not the collective people, but me as a person. I'm going to choose how to respond my way, right? And I've started to think that maybe the best approach is really that we have organizations, groups, whether it's like the National Weather Service or whether it's some other sort of agency, that should be focused on the standardization, because the standardization is also important from being able to track not only protecting people, but how we grow the science and understand the science later, right? And this is important again with all things that impact us, not just weather events. So there's this level of standardization, but maybe that is best where the private sector comes into play and with the personalization, right? Because realistically, me as a person and how I respond best to a weather warning can be very different, not only for someone living across the street, but maybe in my own household. Maybe I'm a visual person. Maybe I'm an audio person. Don't know, right? And each one of us is different. So if I had a system that said, hey, knucklehead, why are you driving through this much rain? This is kind of stupid. I might act differently, where me as a scientist and a weather person will go, actually, in this case, I really just want the statistics because I know enough to make my own judgments if you give me those sort of things. So maybe whether you're a subject matter expert, all those things can come into play. And the systems ought to be there now, where they can take all of the inputs of who we are, right, and look at a baseline underlying forecast and say, this is what knucklehead needs to know, and this is what pseudo-normal person needs to know. And in this case, I'm dealing with pseudo-normal person, and this is what I'm going to tell him, and give him the information relevant to what he's doing today. This is why I think you ought to carry an umbrella today. Okay, good. Thanks for that input. This is the risk if you go out with an umbrella, right? Two different ways of saying the same thing, but maybe one's more relevant to the other, because maybe I don't care, but let's say someone person just perm their hair, and you don't want to get your hair wet. That can be a big no-no, right? So it could be very important, right, for that person to actually have an umbrella just in case rain comes along. I don't know. It just got me to thinking about how different we really are, right? We all are. Yet we live in an age where we ought to be able to adapt constantly, but we're still always going to have this fundamental problem, right? That we stupid people get stuff in our head and are unwilling to change, and we get new information. And God, I wish we were better about that, because us knuckleheads, sometimes we just get stuck. But all this that transpired was a reminder to me that I've got to constantly evolve how I think about the process and how I think about what I should tell people, even in situations where I have to be all those things, both the underlying statistician sort of person, the underlying science person, and the conveyor of the message, right? That sometimes I've got to give multiple messages that say the same thing, just different ways. Maybe that's the interim step. I don't know. But the next time your siren goes off or your alarm or whatever it is, just remember, there's much more to weather than the weather itself.